Hey guys, this is Joe from Analog Archive, back with another video. Video today is going to be a topic video that is centered around one of my new favorite labels, FMP, which is a free jazz label based out of Germany, dating back to 1969. FMP is Free Music Productions. It was a label that was started by Jost Gebers along with Peter Brötzmann. And the kind of inspiration for making this video is because unfortunately last Friday, Jost Gebers died at the age of 83. He was not only the founder of FMP, but he was also the producer and the recording engineer on most FMP sessions. And the body of work of the label is about 200 titles. So the fact that he was kind of single-handedly, for the most part, the producer and the engineer is quite an impressive feat. And the fact that the records really sound great, considering that most, or not most, but a lot of them are live sessions. So a little bit about Jost Gebers. He was originally a jazz bassist, not really clear on how, or there's not really a whole lot of information on exactly if he had recording sessions that kind of led to albums or if he was just like a freelance player. But in the mid 60s, he got involved with some other kind of soon to be big figures in the free jazz movement in Europe and especially in Germany, like Peter Brötzmann, Alexander von Schlippenbach, Evan Parker, players like Sven Ake Johansson, a lot of players that actually ended up being on Peter Brötzmann's second session, the kind of his real infamous one, Machine Gun. A lot of those players kind of came together to form this collective of players, and eventually that led to, in 1969, the start of this FMP jazz label. So as I mentioned, Jost Gebers was the recording engineer, the producer on the majority of the FMP sessions, along with being the head of the label, along with Peter Brötzmann. He was also a social worker, so his ability to kind of be able to juggle both of those is also an impressive feat. For the first 7 years, Jost Gebers, along with Peter Brötzmann, were kind of the co-leaders and kind of figures of the FMP label. And then in 1976, as the collective, as this kind of group of free jazz musicians started to dissipate and go in their own directions, he took full control of the FMP label. So in 1976, he was the sole figure at FMP when it came to producing, engineer, and kind of deciding what was ultimately going to be on the label. In the early 70s, around like 1972, along with Sven Ake Johansson, the great drummer who appeared on Machine Gun, Peter Brötzmann's second session, the two of them started SAJ, which was a subsidiary of FMP that was going to be more geared towards avant-garde and more just sessions that were not really going to fit the free jazz nature, or at least the kind of direction that the FMP label was kind of moving in. Some records I'll show in just a minute are still in a similar vein to it, but for whatever reason, whether it was just the players that were on it, were different than what you saw in FMP. The label, this kind of subsidiary SAJ, was started. The label itself, as I mentioned, FMP started as this collective of musicians that were somewhat underground, that especially with the kind of push of Peter Brötzmann, were able to get Jost Gebers to kind of start this label, this FMP label in 1969. The first two records that were released, or at least some early records that were released on FMP, included reissues, or not reissues, but kind of represses of Peter Brötzmann's first session, so 4 Adolph sax. That's what this represents. This is a very early pressing of this record on FMP. Peter Brötzmann's first two records that he recorded were on his own label. It was called Bro, B-R-O, and then they were kind of numbered, and that actually started. Bro 1, Bro 2 was 4 Adolph sax, and that was 1, and then Bro 2 was Machine Gun, and then that picked up in the early 2000s with some of his other releases. But those first two records, 4 Adolph sax and Machine Gun, ended up being reissued on the FMP label, which was really a great thing, because looking at what the prices are for those first two, they are at least in the mid to high three figures, and potentially even four figures for real clean titles of especially Machine Gun. So that was kind of where the label had started. There was a very small group of musicians that were featured on the FMP label, and it wasn't until around the mid-70s that you started to see a kind of larger group of musicians beyond just kind of a select few. So I've shown this one before. This is Balls, Peter Brötzmann. This has got Peter Brötzmann, Fred Van Hove on piano, and then Han Bennick on the drums. These three musicians featured on quite a few FMP sessions. They were kind of part of that group. Another one, just another Peter Brötzmann one, but kind of other musicians. So this is The End. This also has Albert Mangelsdorf on trombone, along with Fred Van Hove on piano, Han Bennick on the drums. You also had players like Rudiger Karl, again, as I mentioned a few times in the video, Sven Ake Johansson, Alexander von Schlippenbach, Evan Parker, and then there's some other players as well that featured on those early sessions that were probably the first maybe 4 or 5 years of the label. Once you got to about the mid-70s, 75, 76, maybe 77, you again started to see the branching out of the sessions. Again, these were still going to be produced and engineered and recorded by Jost Gebers, but you started to see a larger array of musicians that featured. And as I mentioned before, that SAJ subsidiary, you had like John Chakai solo, and then one song has Albert Mangelsdorf on the trombone. So you've got this addition of great players like John Chakai, who were on the ESP disc label in the 60s, and then you start to see John Chakai on this one, on, again, that subsidiary of FMP. You also have this great session as well, Norbert Mauschlang and Andy Gould, Deep Voices. This was from 77, and then it was recorded in 77, came out in 78. So again, as you got into the later 70s, you started to see the branching out of the musicians that would feature on the FMP label. And that kind of continued into the 80s. Another one, this one is Pan, and then it's V Licht Tau. You've got big players on this is Ernst Ludwig Petrowski, who actually died, I believe, at the beginning of 2023. He featured on some earlier FMP sessions as well. He was, again, part of that niche group in the early days of the label. Yeah, I'm not familiar with the other players on this, but this is from 1983. So even in the 80s, you've got this, again, larger array of musicians, but still sticking to the same kind of mission, which was free jazz, allowing the musicians to play what they wanted. It makes sense, free music productions, ability for these musicians that were underground, especially in Europe, the ability to have a recording label to put their music out on. Now, a big aspect of FMP especially was, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the video, a lot of the sessions were live recordings, very expertly recorded, very good sound quality to them. But because a lot of these records were live recordings, you had this kind of small, again, this small niche group of musicians, and a lot of these sessions were being picked out of these almost like what they called workshops, and I believe that's what it's for this one. Yes, this one is, it says recorded during the workshop Free Music Academy of Arts / Berlin, March 17th and 21st, 1982. So there are a lot of these like free jazz workshops where certain musicians would be invited to play, and then those sessions would be recorded. You saw a lot of that with like Globe Unity in like the early to mid 70s with like Schlippenbach, Brotzman, Evan Parker, Steve Lacy features on a few of those sessions as well. But it was this collective of somewhat, in some cases, larger groups of musicians that had the ability to be able to come together, collaborate, and record this free jazz music that would eventually come out on the FMP label. So a lot of these sessions, especially a lot of the ones I have, when you look at where the recording came from, a lot of them came out of Berlin and were part of these like free music workshops that had been kind of offered. Another session, I mentioned Rudiger Karl was another musician that was there from the beginning. His first session came out in 1972. It was called King Alcohol, New Version. This is one of his later ones. This is from 1988. This is a great session. I mentioned this a few months ago in one of my videos. But again, this is from 1988, and you're still seeing that continuation of the kind of purpose of the label, the mission of the label. When you got into the 90s, just like a lot of other labels, they started going into CDs. In the late 90s, there was a kind of talks of the label changing hands to this woman, and I don't remember what the woman's name was, but she ended up taking the label in a different direction than where kind of Jost Gebers wanted to go. And eventually in the mid 2000s, there was a bunch of lawsuits, and by 2010, the label itself had kind of dissipated, or at least Jost Gebers had kind of cut his ties completely with the label. And so this kind of, at least if you're just looking at Jost Gebers' contribution to the FMP label, it was about a 40-year span. There's at least a solid 20 plus years of really, really solid free jazz music that, again, coming from these underground musicians, where, especially when you think of Peter Brotzman, a lot of his sessions in the 70s and 80s were on the FMP label. He was pretty much exclusively for FMP, and it's difficult to say what exactly, if we'd even be talking about Peter Brotzman today, if it wasn't for this label, this FMP label that Jost Gebers had just expertly managed, put together. And again, it's not that he just simply was part of the label. He had a very significant hand in the recording, the producing. His wife was involved with a lot of the photography that was involved with the session. So what you see in the front and back covers of many of the labels includes his wife. Her name was Dagmar Gebers. And so there was a very comprehensive approach and kind of comprehensive involvement that Jost Gebers had with the FMP label. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is one of my new favorite labels. I'm continuing to find more FMP releases and just loving what I'm hearing, the sounds, just the creativity that you hear from the musicians. And so it's an excellent label to check out, especially if you're interested in free jazz. Um, it's obviously very sad that, especially in this last year, we've lost quite a few figures that were affiliated with FMP. Again, Petrowski died at the beginning of the year. You had Peter Brotzman that died at the end of June, and then just this past week at the September 15th, Jost Gebers passed away. So that's just kind of a quick idea of FMP, the different albums. There's probably more information, but unfortunately, even though FMP, a lot of people, especially that like free jazz, are very well aware of FMP, there is not a lot of information on the label beyond just some basics of who was affiliated with the label, but there's not a huge comprehensive history of it or anything. So I just tried to provide a little bit of idea of where kind of the label started and how that progressed. But as I mentioned, this is an excellent label to check out. I hope that people enjoyed this video. If you did, please think about liking and subscribing, and I will see you in the next vinyl video. Bye.